This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I have a sneaky suspicion that a lot of you are going to really like this particular conversation. My guest today is Campbell Harvey, Canadian economist known for his work on asset allocation with changing risk and risk premiums and emerging markets finance. He's a professor at Duke University as well as a research associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research in Massachusetts. For those of you that love the conversation of the bell curve and skew and risk and volatility, Campbell is extremely proficient at really good explanations. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Campbell Harvey. So listen, let me break this apart with you. You've got this interesting paper that I've come to be aware of called Evaluating Trading Strategies. And I want to kind of unpack how that started. And before we get into the trading aspect of that, I wonder if you could use the example that goes into football first and just kind of like let the audience slowly come into this thinking.
Right. So there are plenty of sports examples here too. And maybe football is one of them, where like a team could have many wins in a row, or a quarterback many passes in a row. And the issue is that due to skill, or is it luck, or is it a combination? It's also the case that the quarterback could appear to do quite poorly in not making that many passes. That doesn't necessarily mean that the quarterback lacks skill. It could just be bad luck. Again, if you're evaluating in real time whether to pull the athlete or not, this needs to be taken into account. It is the same thing with investment managers, where you can outperform the market many, many years in a row. It's not clear that that's a result of skill or a result of just good luck. And it is a vexing problem in finance. How do we separate the skill from the luck?
Before we get into your paper and the example that you have in particular about a particular trading firm, their strategy, I was just thinking as you were talking about beating the market for many years in a row, I'm quite fond of him. He's like some of my work. I've had a chance to meet him several times. He had a fantastic run at Legg Mason, and that's Bill Miller. I think he beat the S&P for 14 years in a row, I believe. But then at the end of the 14-year stretch, there was a pretty significant drawdown in the 2008 crisis. So I think this, as you make this point about skill versus luck, there's no doubt it's not an easy subject, is it?
No, and look, it can be a combination. That's the thing. It's really interesting if you group the best performing hedge funds or mutual funds and then hold those for the next period and just keep on doing that. So you just buy the winners, like the extreme winners. You just have that as a strategy. Then what you find is that portfolio does poorly. Some of this is just luck, that the people at the very top probably were blessed with good luck. That doesn't mean that they're unskilled. They could still be skilled. Yeah. But they were skilled plus the luck that got them up there. And this is the way that I usually like to explain this. And suppose that you just like grab a whole bunch of dice, like a large number, let's say 36 dice, and you drop them on the table. And then you go pick out all of the ones that show 6. And let's say there's about 7 of them, and take all the other dice away off the table. Then you drop the ones that all have 6. And you're going to get a combination of 1, 2, 3. It's going to average of about 3. And think of that as the people that did really well. The sixes are the people that were at the very top, that did the best. And then when you throw those dice again, it's just natural that you're not going to get 7 sixes from those dice. So a lot of this has to do with regression to the mean and luck.
I was thinking of two very famed investors, traders. One very famous, one not so famous, but just as successful. Jim Simons at Renaissance Technologies. I mean, he's had math formulas named after him. He will come out loudly and clearly always say, hey, I'm a very lucky guy. Now, that's not, as you just say, that's not taking away from his skill. And I could think of the most famous USA investor, the wealthiest USA investor. He also says, he says, look, I won the ovarian lottery. I mean, that's Warren Buffett. So there's clearly a piece of luck at play. And I think as we start to talk about, as we start to move into your paper, the notion of survivorship bias really starts to become an interesting topic because, if we are to look at particular trading strategies or particular traders, I always say to myself, and not in any way to take anything away from Warren Buffett, but there's not a lot of other Warren Buffetts.
That's true. And I think that Jim Simons, Warren Buffett are probably
they're up there.
they are up there, and they are saying, "Well, I was lucky." I really that's a hard one to believe. I know Jim Simons. I don't know Warren Buffett. They do very different things. From what I know of Simon's operations, there's a lot of skill there, but as you say, it can be a combination of having skill and good luck.
Well, you got to have a strategy. You got to have a strategy that's predicated. I'm thinking maybe for both of them, perhaps you have a strategy that puts you in a position to benefit, which I think is a skill to think this through, puts you in a position to benefit when the unexpected happens. If one has a strategy that can operate like that, that starts to be skill-like.
Yes, no, definitely. And again, it might not always work.
Sure, process versus outcome. You could have a great process, and it doesn't necessarily mean that outcomes could be beautiful every time, right?
That is correct. And you mentioned survivorship bias, the people, the winners are the ones that survive. There is a kind of reverse type of bias, and that is that some very skilled investment managers drop out because they've had bad luck. That's kind of a reverse survivorship bias. But this is really important, that this idea doesn't just apply to investment managers. Just let me discuss just for a minute another research paper I have that does a psychometric survey of CEOs. What my paper finds is that CEOs are hugely more tolerant of risk than the lay population, like by a factor of 10. It's extraordinary. And you can think of a scenario where these people that are very tolerant of risk enter a firm as a junior employee. They take a lot of risk, and some of them they get lucky, it turns out. Others, they don't get lucky and they drop out of the firm. And then these people that are taking a lot of risk with enough luck will rise to the top and be the CEO. Whereas the person that's risk averse never takes that extra bit of risk, never experiences the good luck, and is stuck in the middle of the firm. So this explains why the CEOs happen to be very tolerant of risk. The interplay of that plus luck, I think, goes a long way to explain kind of the kind of psychometric qualities of CEOs.
I can think of two very famed investors, heads of investment banks, who I think until the fall of 2008 were just, for the vast population out there that understood what they did, they were viewed as Prince Charming, nothing could go wrong. Maybe Ace Greenberg at Bear Stearns and Dick Fold at Lehman Brothers. I mean, these were guys that I think would fit right into the outline that you were describing. But then on the backside of an entire career of taking more risk, waking up one day and the dice come up different, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, risk is two-sided. So there's an upside and a downside. And this was obviously a negative realization. It's really hard because they were on a roll, so to speak. This could be bad luck or it could be lack of skill.
You know, as we were talking about the survivorship bias issue, and we're going to probably talk about that multiple times today, but I was thinking, you said, well, it could have been very successful investors, and then they drop out after a long, like the two I just mentioned, a long string of success, and then boom, they drop out because of. I sometimes think, though, that as another side of that coin, I often see that we'll talk about successful investors, and then we'll say, well, survivorship bias, they're the lucky ones left. What about all the other guys that failed? The implication being that everyone that failed was as skilled and had the same technique or same strategy as those winners, which I think sometimes that's not, I don't necessarily see that evidence all the time. I think sometimes we just assume they were equal, but they're not necessarily equal or taking the same steps or strategies. Just another facet of this, right?
Yeah, totally agree. There could be a much different strategy. But like in the end, that's what they choose. So you could think of every investor having a slightly different strategy. Some of them might be chasing real risk premia. Some of them think that they're chasing real risk premia, but it turns out that it's not. Others are chasing mispricing in the market that might be fleeting. Indeed, it might turn the other way, that once you start buying, all of a sudden, instead of something being undervalued, it's overvalued. So there's just a myriad of different strategies out there, and some of them will turn out because they should turn out, like capturing a long-term risk premium, and some of them will turn out just by luck.
You're just excited in terms of your research. Was it random?
That's correct. So I think that we don't do a very good job at basically questioning the performance and basically saying, was this due to luck or was it due to skill on both sides? So this is very important. So we look at these investment manager stars and think that they've got a huge amount of skill, and we don't consider the other side. How much of that is luck? As I said, goes both ways, where and you know how often this happens, where you hire an investment manager. You look at the track record. It's a wonderful track record. You're comfortable with the track record. You invest with the manager, and then they have like 1 or 2 years of subpar performance, and then you fire them. And as soon as you fire them, the next year they do great. Well, what's the story there? Well, it's a simple story of just like I mentioned with the dice. You have a couple of years of bad luck. Indeed, in the track record, there's probably a couple of years like that too. But you tend to ignore that. You fire the person at exactly the wrong time and you pay the price. So investors just don't do a very good job of attempting to weigh the balance of luck and skill.
Okay, before we get into your paper, I want you to put your professor hat on for a moment. And I think one of the reasons that perhaps so many people get confused is that we want to think in terms of this nice normal distribution, because it works great for weights and heights and all this kind of stuff. And it's just fantastic. Everything's just normally distributed. But in the real world of asset management and trading and investing, there's something called skew. Why don't I let you run with it here for a few minutes as you're opening up to the class for the first time to try and unpack a little bit of this wrong thinking about the normal distribution. And what skew is exactly?
Sure. And this is an important component of my own research. There's a path-breaking paper published in 1952 by Harry Markowitz on how to kind of optimize a portfolio. That paper led to a Nobel Prize for him in 1990. And basically what this paper does is it says, well, what we want is a portfolio with the best possible target return, but the lowest volatility for that level of target return. Essentially, this is the optimal trade-off of expected return and risk. And I'd like to put risk in quotations because in this path-breaking paper, there's a footnote that's buried at the end of the paper that basically says, this only is appropriate if the asset returns are normal and investors have no preference for skew. So let me explain what that actually means. If the asset returns are so-called normally distributed, then there's no unusual tail behavior. That means that there's no severe downside. There's no severe upside. The upside and the downside are exactly symmetric. The usual measure of volatility, that's exactly what happens. That, for example, you could have a stock that is going up dramatically. Maybe it goes up like 300, 400%, and it's got a high level of volatility. And you can have another stock that goes down dramatically, maybe goes down 95%, and it's got the exact same level of volatility. Volatility doesn't tell you anything about the direction. It's measuring the surprises in an absolute sense. So volatility is symmetric. It treats the upside and the downside the same. Skew, on the other hand, tells us the balance between the upside and the downside. So you could have two portfolios that have the same target return, that have the same volatility, but they've got a different skew. So one has got an abnormally high probability of a severe downside. The other has got an abnormally high probability of severe upside. So for any investor, it's obvious which one to choose. You choose the one that has got more upside than downside. I've been on a campaign for many years to try to change the way that we think of risk, change the way that we actually do asset management or portfolio management, to take this asymmetry between the upside and the downside, to recognize that it is rare that any asset return is so-called normally distributed, and actually make that part of the portfolio management exercise, and equally as important, make it part of the risk management exercise. I am tired about hearing about these 20 standard deviation events, like what happened to the Swiss franc, or and there's many other during the financial crisis, the Russian crisis, all this stuff. 20 standard deviation events. It's not 20 standard deviations. It's only 20 if you believe naively that these asset returns are normally distributed. They're not. So don't even tell me this. It doesn't make any sense.
I've had Harry on my show. I had a chance to meet him before. He's a really neat guy. He's still sharp as a tack. I think he would make the argument, and I think he has, that like, okay, I did my paper, and this was, I don't want to use the word exercise, but that's what's coming to my mind right now. I think he was surprised at how the industry took his work, and he really wasn't a part of what happened, but they kind of took his work and ran with it. And that was essentially how modern finance got built off the back of his work, isn't it? That's a fair brief synopsis, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I was at a conference with him 3 weeks ago. It is that 1952 paper is an amazing paper. I've only mentioned one thing that he foresaw. There's another important one also. Yeah, I think that this was like a simple framework that he proposed, it works under special assumptions. He was the one that recognized what those assumptions were, but then you're right, the industry just goes with something and doesn't think about, like, when is it appropriate to apply and when isn't it? When I teach finance at Duke University, it's one of the main lessons for my students is, okay, we've got these models. All these models are wrong. That's why they're called a model. You're simplifying reality. And the issue of applying your skill is knowing when to apply a simplified framework and when not to. In certain situations, it's fine. Other situations, no. So I think that Harry is really the father of modern finance, and that paper is just an incredible piece of work, given that he saw not just the usefulness of his simplified framework, but he saw basically how to take it to the next level and to incorporate this idea of skew.
Let's jump into, as I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, your paper, Evaluating Trading Strategies. And it did catch my eye for one thing in particular, which is your early example. And I want you to explain how you selected this. And I want to make sure that, I assume that I knew the advisor that you were talking about, which was AHL, which is a managed futures trading operation owned by Man out of London. That was the example, right?
Yeah. So let me describe the example. And it's from a seminar at Man AHL, who, as you say, is a managed futures house that manages about $15 billion. So at AHL, they look at strategies all the time. They think very deeply about this luck versus skill. This is a strategy that basically they showed a cumulative profit from 2004 through 2014. It's a graph, and it's basically going straight up. It's extraordinary strategy where it's got 1 year that has a very small negative return in 2004. It knocks the ball out of the park during the financial crisis. It's got about a 15% annualized return, 15% volatility. So a so-called Sharpe ratio of 1, extremely consistent. We're looking at this strategy, and you can see people's head nodding. Yes, this is the sort of thing we want to put some capital on. And then the very next slide is really surprising. It adds to this graph the other 199 purely random strategies. So all of a sudden, this graph that was just one line going straight up is added 199 things that basically are centered around zero. The exercise was to simulate 200 random strategies with a target return of 0. So every single one has no skill. It's purely generated numbers and a 15% volatility. And you see the very top one, the very best one, is the one that was shown first. And then you see at the bottom, there's like a terrible one that earns 15% negative, and everything in between. And the idea is that just by pure random chance, and that's what the random number generator is doing, by random chance, you're going to see strategies that look great. You need to be very careful in a company. If you're doing internal research, what you don't want is your researchers sifting through hundreds of strategies and just picking off the top one. Because when you put money on that top one in real time, it's going to do poorly.
Now, this was AHL presenting this information. You were at an event.
Yeah, because again, they're leading edge in terms of thinking about luck versus skill, and this was part of an exercise on how to avoid overfitting of back tests. So that's why that exhibit is there, because it is a great example that you could easily be fooled. easily be fooled by random strategies.
What is your perspective, just as a kind of little interjection here, what is your perspective, your thoughts about the work of Nassim Taleb, the black swan thinking?
Oh, well, it fits in really well with my work on skewness. He talks about so-called black swan events. And again, these events that are like negative 20 standard deviation events, it doesn't make any sense unless it's a normal distribution. Because within a normal distribution, the probability of something like that happening is like one event in the life of the universe, which doesn't make any sense. So he's talking about these things that are basically not, you don't necessarily see them in historical data, but then they happen. A so-called negative, you could think of it as an extreme negative skew type of event. So that works in really well because his view of the world, as my view of the world, is that it's not symmetrically distributed. It's not normally distributed. So I think that that's important.
Coming back to the point you were making a second ago, though, I think when you have researchers, you have someone, massive, I use a third-party example, a TradeStation software, and people start inventing strategies. Most of the top traders that I've talked to, and I was looking at AHL, I've had a chance to talk to the H and the L in AHL, but I was thinking that you really need to have an economic thought process as to why this particular strategy might work. So, for example, if we were talking managed futures, we've been talking skew. Many of the managed futures trading strategies obviously are trend following in nature, and they're predicated on not really knowing what's going to happen next. A lot of their risk premia comes from hedging. I mean, other hedgers out there. I mean, people can make arguments about where their source of profits come from. But I mean, there's a thinking, a long-standing thinking that goes behind this particular strategy. And I think you're making the point that, hey, if you just sit down at your computer and you really have not even philosophically thought through what the strategy is, and then you only want to trust some random systems that come up and there's really not a thought process behind those systems, you can wake up in some trouble. Even if initially all your investors are sold on the idea of 15% returns and 15% volatility, and that sounds great, and you raise $1 billion, but if there's not a sound economic thinking behind what the strategy is, we all know what's going to happen.
That's correct. So this is the way that it should work. And I do know from direct experience, this is the way that it does work at a firm like Man AHL. And maybe it's no surprise that they've done so well with this. So basically, a researcher would come up with an idea, but without looking at the data. So they come up with an economic framework. And then they actually pitch that framework in a seminar. I'll call it that. It's like an academic seminar. They will get feedback, and then the senior people will actually decide whether the economic idea makes enough sense that you actually go to the data. Let's say it does make sense, then the firm will give the researcher what's known as a random partition of the history of the data. So they will give bits and pieces of the history to the researcher. The researcher will then test the economic idea, and this is the so-called in-sample testing. And then there'll be another seminar. The results will be presented of this exercise, and then a decision will be made whether to give the rest of the data to test it in a so-called out-of-sample. So it might be killed, or it might go ahead to the out-of-sample. So let's say it actually goes to the out-of-sample, and let's say it does well. Then there's a further stage where it will be invested in, but only invested with internal money. So it's multiple stages that you actually have to go through until it gets to client, because you really don't want to put anything to client trading that might be a result of luck, because you don't want to disappoint your clients. All the incentives are running the right direction to do the best possible thing for your client.
I want to go into a couple other issues as we wind down. I was giving a presentation in Singapore this spring, and I was speaking about the managed futures trading strategy of trend following. And at the end of the presentation, this young lady raised her hand, and she just had this look that said she probably had been at Duke in one of your classes and really, really was bright. She just had that look that said, "Oh man, I'm in trouble. She's going to kill me. She's going to obliterate me. I'm dead." And she raises her hand, and she immediately shot herself in the foot. And I want you to kind of explain why. But she immediately was like, "Okay, can you tell me about the Sharpe ratio of these strategies?" And I wanted to do a Vulcan mind meld and just say, hold on, let's don't just immediately assume the Sharpe ratio is the be all end all. Let's at least pick apart the pros and cons of the Sharpe ratio. But you could just see the indoctrination as she asked the question.
Yeah, incredibly naive, but this is the way it is in industry, and like on both sides, buy side, sell side, that people will look at an investment, look at the Sharpe ratio, which is the expected excess return, usually over some benchmark, divided by the volatility. So they are only considering the volatility risk. And let me tell you the type of trouble that gets you into. If you do like the Sharpe ratios of different investment styles, or maybe even like hedge fund returns, you'll see a wide variation in the average Sharpe ratios. You'll see gigantic Sharpe ratios for things like convertible arbitrage, but more modest Sharpe ratios for things like managed futures. And the reason is very clear once you expand the way you think about risk. Managed futures has got positive skew. And it's almost by construction, because when things are going up, you're buying. That's the same as replicating a long call option. When things are going down, you're selling. That's like replicating a long put option. So effectively, you can think of managed futures as something with a long straddle, like performance, which has got positive skew. So they do really well in market meltdowns, and they do well when the market's going up sharply. So that is something that is rewarded by investors. They actually like that. It provides a hedge. Whereas these other Sharpe ratio, very high Sharpe ratio strategies, they can have severe negative skew. So for them, you need to have some extra return on average, because investors really don't like that severe downside. So you cannot compare two strategies based upon a Sharpe ratio if they have different skew properties. The Sharpe ratio does not take that into account. Indeed, it's very similar to what we were talking about earlier with the simple Markowitz framework, where you look at expected target return divided by volatility. Volatility is not a sufficient metric for risk. It is part of the story. It's not the entire story. If you make the mistake of just looking at volatility, then it's going to lead to a portfolio that will disappoint you.
I was thinking back to that example I just mentioned with the young lady, and the moment I started to try to unpack the conversation, the Sharpe ratio, and talking about upside volatility, the blinders went on. It was just like, don't say anything else. I didn't know if it was I didn't want to listen, or I don't understand, or I've already got my mind made up. It was just, the indoctrination just strikes me.
Well, it's complicated, because this sort of discussion is not even in the textbooks in finance. It's kind of surprising. So you can go through a top program.
That is a truest statement. Anyone listening right now that doubts you, I want them to go find where you're wrong.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I don't use a textbook for what I teach. I teach out of my own notes and my own research articles. But this is something that you have to point a lot of fingers here, including pointing fingers at my own colleagues. So I just don't think that we do a good job of explaining risk to our students. I think in my classes, about 3 classes, we just sit down and just think about what risk actually is.
That's such a great, you're making an absolutely fantastic point there. And I'm thinking this as we're talking, it's the put aside all the jargon and to get people to conceptually wrap their arms around the idea of what skew is. And even getting rid of the word skew, so to speak, and getting people to sit down and look at it all and really just, I think a freshman in high school with no math training, if properly explained what's going on, could understand this.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let me give the other insight
Sure.
in Markowitz's article that is relevant for this discussion. And that is that his framework assumes that you exactly know all of the inputs. You exactly know the volatilities. You exactly know correlations between assets, and you exactly know the target return. Exactly. There's no uncertainty in any of the inputs. Whereas in the practice of management, there is uncertainty. So another dimension of risk is that you think the correlation is, let's say, 0.5, but you're not sure. Maybe it's 0.2, maybe it's 0.7, but it's certainly not exactly 0.5. The same for the volatility. You think it's 15, but you're uncertain. Maybe it's 12, maybe it's 17. This is another dimension of risk. So most people think, well, risk is just the volatility. Well, another way of thinking about risk is, well, what if you don't know what the volatility is? Well, even deeper, what if you don't know the distribution? So it's not normal. We kind of know that, but what is it? So, or the skew. We don't know what that downside tail actually is. We can maybe estimate it, but we're not sure. All of this is risk, and it's rarely taken into account at this level, that there's a difference between risk and uncertainty. People usually group those together, and it shows that they really haven't thought it through.
You know, I think one last point to kind of end on as we talk about the notion of estimates and so many of the decision makers out there that are in charge of institutional money or making allocations. I mean, it'd be a long story to get to the point as to why many of them have maybe a faulty foundation. But the fact that so many decision makers that are in charge of other people's money think that somehow or another there is a perfect prediction for tomorrow, and that estimates are a bad thing when estimates are basically all we got. It's really crazy as you know what, that we've got to a position where there's so many people that think the world of investment management is supposed to be perfection. It's just an insane notion that we've got ourselves to this day and age.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the actual investors kind of reinforce this because they will judge the manager based upon the past quarter or the past year. And that leads to a different type of behavior on the part of the manager. I would much prefer, as I said earlier, take a look at the track record. You're comfortable with it, fine. And what I actually recommend that investors do, and the investment managers, is to educate the client as to what could happen. So one way of doing that is really simple. Let's say I've got a 20-year track record. What I can do is to create, with the real data from those 20 years, an alternative history by kind of randomly sampling years and put them together. And then just keep on doing that. Then it gives you a way to look at what things could look like given the track record. So then when it actually happens, maybe you've got 2 years in a row of substandard performance, you can look at the history and say, well, gee, that's not unusual. That happens 25% of the time, given the track record. So if you believe the actual track record, and you actually analyze it in this way of creating alternative histories, then it really helps you avoid the mistake of firing a skilled manager, basically because they've had some bad luck.
If I see 1% a month, every year, I'm either thinking it's Bernie Madoff Jr. or another long-term capital management. You just can't make money every month. I mean, maybe there's somebody with a high-frequency shop that's got some insane advantage that no one else has, but it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, this is a great example of, actually, one of my exam questions was almost exactly this. So you've got somebody that is basically an S&P 500 portfolio, but on top of the S&P 500, they're writing out-of-the-money put options and out-of-the-money call options. If there's not that much volatility, you're collecting a premium. Month after month, given that premium that you're collecting, they beat the market. 1% here, 2%, 1%, 2%. It just keeps on going. It's a legitimate strategy. It is foolish to think that that is beating the market or alpha or whatever you want to call it. That's called taking risk, because if the market goes severely down, then you've got these put options you have to pay off. It magnifies the downside of holding the S&P 500. And on top of that, it cuts off the upside, because if the market goes up substantially, you need to pay out for the call options. So all that does is to take a portfolio, the S&P 500, and tilt it towards negative skew. And that's the reason that you see a return pattern like this, that people are getting a little extra return because at some point there's going to be a severe downside. So I think that is important to take into account.
It's cliche, but that free lunch thing really isn't so free. So, hey, Campbell, listen, I appreciate you coming on today, and I hope you enjoyed the time. I really think people are going to like this episode. You are a pro's pro in terms of interviewees, so I appreciate you coming on. Where can we send people to check you out, more of your work? Where's the best place for them to go? I know you got a Wikipedia page up, which probably leads to everything, but you fire out the URL.
You could go at Cam Harvey on Twitter. That would, and my blog is called Garden of Econ altogether.
I hope you come on again. I'm going to have to start checking out your papers. It's a difficult subject, but to break this down, and maybe I'm too far in the clouds too these days, I don't know, but to break it down and try and get these subjects unfiltered and to make sense is a challenge. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.